Hi, this is Paul. This is a very unusual thing for me. My wife has a field trip this evening. We just had our estuary at Living Stones, and so it's about 10 o'clock at night. And sorry, Jacob is live streaming. I don't want to step on Jacob's diatribe against Doug Wilson. I guess that's part four against Protestants. I guess part three was against me. I don't remember who part two was against, but it was it was against someone. But actually, because I have a little bit of time, I'm not especially tired. Had a nice estuary meeting, and I thought I would try StreamYard a little bit. So I'm not in my office. I don't have my usual setup, but I there's just a whole bunch of videos out there I wanted to do something with, and I thought I would make a comment about this. Today, we recorded our third marriage crisis video with Rod and Eamon and Catherine. And um, I think as oh, hey, Byrne is up in Tbilisi. I wonder if I can give Byrne a wrench. Let's see. Nope, can't. Anyway, um, I saw this video of Jordan's, and I've never played a video in StreamYard before, so I wanted to kind of try it. So here we go. Let me know if you can't hear it. Let me know. Oh, that's helpful. Can't hear the video. Well, see, that's why we play with things. Let's check the presets. Now sharing your screen. Hide. Check the presets. Oops. Preset. Share screen. Screens let you share audio. Look for share audio checkbox in the next window. Aha. Share system audio. Share. Be careful sharing audio screen. If you have a guest, they will hear themselves. So, okay. Let's let's uh let's give it a shot again.
What seems to provide people with stabilization in their life and hope is the fostering of a hierarchical network of social interactions, so that it's pretty hard to be sane and to have a functional identity without being married or the equivalent if you're an adult. You need someone who's a long-term partner, because otherwise your life is a mess of loneliness or short-term chaotic relationships. And it's very difficult to be sane and happy when that's happening. It's very hard to maintain your equilibrium unless you have at least some family, right? Some siblings, parents that you have a bonded relationship with, that you're in interaction with, that you have joint projects with. You have to have friends. You should be involved in a network of economic exchange. You should be pursuing some civic responsibility. Maybe you have a religious obligation that's a different way of thinking about it than a religious faith, right? Is that you have an obligation to pursue and participate in some spiritual tradition. And it has to be a tradition too, because otherwise it just spirals off into a kind of new age insanity.
Now, one of the things we actually talked about this a little bit at the estuary tonight. It was interesting. We've had more and more women in our Sacramento estuary, which has been really wonderful. We're not quite up to half, but probably this evening, about a third of the participants, quarter to a third of the participants were women. And the marriage crisis conversation came up again there. and the woman she was actually there with her boyfriend, but she was oh, good. We'll bring Byrne in. The woman was she was actually there with her boyfriend. Got to mute your YouTube window, Byrne.
Done.
So I'll finish my thought and
continue.
It was interesting because she was complaining about the fact that the dating is so complex now, because it used to be that you had assumed roles, and so all you had to know to sort of enter into the forum was your assumed role. And now there's questions of equality, questions of should you open the door for who, how should that work? And I mentioned the fact that if you have a sort of an established religious tradition that has thick community and thick expectations, there's at least a set of norms that are publicly known. You can kind of walk in and play them. So I don't know. I'll finish. I'll play. I've only got a couple more minutes of this clip. It's actually only an 8-minute clip, and this piece of Peterson is only a few minutes. So I'm going to keep you in the waiting room, Byrne, and then I'll bring you out. Okay. There we go. I'm just again playing with this stuff.
And it isn't obvious to me that people can live happy lives because people say they want to be happy, which I don't really think is also true. I think people want to have an adventure and they don't want to be miserable. And that's not exactly the same as being happy. But I don't think that you can pursue any of that stably without being embedded in that multitude of hierarchical social relationships. And that's all dependent on responsibility, not on short-term self-gratification and a kind of atomistic hedonism. And if you explain that to young people, they figure it out right away, especially if you ally that with the idea of developing the kind of embeddedness in the social community that helps sustain you in the face of tragedy. Because what do you have when things go wrong? You've got the people you love and who love you. You've got your friends. You've got hopefully your career and maybe your creative endeavors. You have the service you can provide to others at the level of civic responsibility. And all of that, none of that's been discussed in some real sense for about 60 years. And all of that's core to the kind of identity that stops people from being absolutely anxiety-ridden and hopeless. And conservatives really have all that within their grasp if they wanted to take it. And it sounds like that's the sort of thing that you're working on pursuing.
That's exactly right. And
all right. I wasn't really interested in the politician, so we'll not worry about him. But I thought that point about anxiety and established roles, and I think I'll bring Byrne in now because actually, Byrne, you are living in a part of the world, and I'm really curious about this. Is your sense of what's happening in Georgia, are the sort of the gender roles sort of still intact, and do you have a sense that dating among people has sort of been pulled apart, or do you think it's much more still intact?
Yes and no, because the Georgians still have much more of a sense of traditional gender roles. But here's what I've noticed. I've been here since the end of 2018. I first visited in 2016. In 2016, for instance, you would see absolutely maybe one or two Georgians, say women, with any sort of color in their hair. Now you see it regularly. Now you see more regularly, for instance, things like tattoos, things like piercings and such. It's almost like they've entered the late 90s. But it's strange because, yes, there are traditional gender roles. When I talk to the most left wing of people that I can find here, and I have a few friends that say, yeah, I'm left wing. And then I'll go like, and I'll show them what's happening with the whole what is a woman debate and, you know, the stuff. And they go like, oh, no, that's way too far. And I tell them, you know, you're kind of on one side of a hill that we climbed in the West a while ago. We're on the other side of that hill. And it's created a lot of confusion for us.
do you think they will learn by watching the West, or do you think they're just gonna stumble into it, or do you think that I mean, they have a thick culture. It's an old culture. Do you think that will give them some resistance, or do you think that technology and affluence, if they come to Georgia, will just sort of carry them along in it?
Well, the technology is here, although not as, for instance, this kind of thing is very foreign to them. I have a friend who's a fine Orthodox young woman. She's about 30 years old, Orthodox Christian, who wants to start a YouTube channel. And she's a very strict Orthodox Christian, very intelligent. And at the same time, it's like grasping this stuff and these modes of communication is still a little, it's like they don't quite understand. I'll tell them I have a YouTube channel and they're like, wow, they don't quite get the social aspect of it the way we do. And part of it is, I think it's a defect on our side as well, that we have quarantined off our social relationships into these virtual spheres. And I think, for instance, outside of my back window, there is a park area that has some car parking, but in the middle of it, there is an area for people to sit. Georgians often come outside to smoke back there. But what you'll see is the young people in their teens, people in their 20s coming outside and just spending the evening talking to each other in the summer. Now, this is something very foreign to what's going on in America these days, in the West.
Yeah.
That people would just go outside and spend time talking to each other.
It didn't used to be that way, though. I mean, going outside.
I remember that when I was a child.
Yeah,
Not a child, but when I was younger, people would just more hang out. Part of it is a teenage thing. You like to explore your emotions and talk and joke around. But part of it is also, I mean, the old men do that too. The 45-year-old women are out there too. And I go out to the park. I'm about a block away from one of the largest parks in the city, and it's like a community out there. They have like some weightlifting material, stuff, and kind of an outdoor gym. And you see people there all the time. They're kind of interacting a little bit. You see people with their dogs. You see, there's more of an emphasis, I think, on communication and such. I think the isolation that we experience in the West is utterly foreign to them. But the more time they spend ingesting our media, using the technology that obviously is all over the world now, the more that affects them. So I have a friend who told me that 10 years ago, he said, if you went to any Georgian restaurant, you might hear a group of men suddenly break into one of these beautiful Georgian folk songs. Now he says that just doesn't happen as much anymore. Why? Everyone's sitting there looking at their phone.
Wow. Do you think, I was going to say, what degree do you think television did this? But they've, of course, had television for a long time there. Mm-hmm. I get the sense that, once TV came, it was just easy to be in your house with the people you live with. Mm-hmm. Of course, I mean, urban cultures, American suburban culture, I think, was very quickly sort of captured by set. Urban cultures, you had public spaces that you could go to. And I think for many people, actually interacting with live human beings was more fun, more engaging than, let's say, sitting home and watching TV. But Georgia, of course, has had TV for a while. And it's interesting, your comment about the cell phone, that, perhaps the cell phone will be the thing that sort of pushes them over the edge.
I think it's pushing everyone over the edge. I think it is a real game changer. Television was big when it first came in the 50s and 60s. As Dennis Leary, the comedian, once said, we watched President Kennedy, that was a big, huge news event. Then we watched Oswald get shot live on television, and we could never turn away from the television after that because you never knew what was going to happen.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah,
That one event
that's
sort
the
of
television generation. Now we're living in this weird. But what's interesting is I have friends here who are, 20, 21 years old, young Georgians, and they get fascinated talking to me because one of the big questions is like, why are you living here?
like, oh, we'd like to go live where you should be living. Why are you
Exactly.
staying
And then
by
I
us?
tell them, I said, well, here's your America. You have New York City, maybe Washington, D.C., you've got Florida, you've got Texas, and then you've got California, mostly Southern California. That's your America. And because that's what you see in movies. And you don't understand what America is really like. For instance, you have no idea that, so you want to go to New York City. They all want to go to New York City or Los Angeles. And you say, like, you have no idea that what you're making now in a year would barely cover the cost of an apartment for a month in New York City.
Yeah.
You have no idea also of, how would you like to live where you don't have any relatives? You don't have your grandmother nearby. You don't have your aunts and uncles. You don't have your clan. I mean, yeah, you can find other Georgians there. They're out in the Brighton Beach area, in New York, in Brooklyn, and there's some places in New Jersey. But basically, what you're used to as reality isn't there. It's very different. And in America, I think about this all the time. Did I tell you about my revelation about that I had about the metro and insanity and the difference between insanity in America, that you see all these crazy people versus what I saw? Well, in the metro here, it's a subway system. And, there's a little line about a foot and a half away from the edge so you don't step into the way of the car. And and one day I was kind of looking down for the train, and there was all these other Georgians. I was down at one end, and then I stepped back. I didn't step back because I was worried about the train hitting me. It was quite a ways off. I stepped back because my New York City instincts kicked in. And because in New York City, you can be pushed into the line. And I saw a statistic about a month ago that said in 2022, 29 people have been pushed into the subways in New York City this year.
Yeah.
But I looked and I said, and I just looked at all the faces. I said, none of these people are going to push me in.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking about it. I don't see insanity here. I don't see the kind of craziness that you would see on the streets of San Francisco right now or in New York City, or the kind of, I used to see this all the time. And I said, why? I said, is there a lot of insanity here that's hidden away? I said, maybe a little somewhere. But, and then I thought about, there's people on the street asking for money, but they're all like older women, older men, sometimes young kids who are playing guitar or something. But these people all have somewhere to go to at night. They go home. They're out there just getting a little extra money for the family. Some of them have health problems, that sort of thing. But no homeless as we know them. No people with. I've been here now 4 years. 4 years as of a couple of days ago. 3 people I've seen in buses and on the streets that I would classify being somewhat like some of the people I would see all the time in New York City. Yeah. 3 kind of crazy people talking to themselves, smelling a bit. 3 in 4 years in a city of like 1.5 million people.
Wow.
And so I said to myself when I had this like revelation, this was about 3 years ago, I said, why don't they have the problems we have? And I said, it's because they all know exactly where their families are. They all know that almost all of them have some family in the city, even though, but they also all know what village they come from. And that village is like an anchor point for them, so that, for instance, when things get really tight here, they all know where the food is. The food is back there because the land here is very fertile. And all the way through the city, there are grapevines and walnut trees and fig trees and berries and apricots just growing on the city streets, just falling. People just ignore them. But in the case of an emergency, there they are. They have been tremendously poor in the 90s when they were having a civil war, but they always had food. And so what I realize is that what we do in America is we've especially entered this phase after the 60s. We push our kids out to go to be on their own. But and I felt this in New York. I was there 16 years, and about halfway through, I could feel the city breaking me down as an individual without family there. I had friends, but then again in New York City, a certain amount of your friends are going to cycle out. And so you don't have anyone who keeps an eye on you. I mean, I did have friends who lasted most of the time there, and especially the people born in the city, the New Yorkers, New Yorkers. Those people are always there. But, when you go to a place like New York or San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, whatever, you're going to be among mostly people who are like you. You're going to be among the people who've migrated there in order to do something. Sometimes just in order to be hip. That was more the case as I left. So I just realized we emphasize so much the individual that for us, the graduation is going away and getting out of town. Whereas the Georgians are always connected to their families somehow.
Well, it's so many of the homeless people that I know do in fact have family in Sacramento. There was one guy, he was 72, showed up on the church property. This was about 5 years ago. Just showed up all of a sudden and started sleeping there, stopped, chatted with him, got his name. Sometimes because I'm the pastor, they're a little reticent to tell me their story, but they tell each other their stories. And so I get the story from the other guy. And basically he had developed a meth habit and his wife got sick of it and put him out. And he lived for about, he basically lived on the church grounds for about 4 years until we put up the fence. He accumulated an unbelievable amount of garbage. His granddaughter would come and visit him sometimes. But his wife lived right down the road from the church. And, in a case like that, and in other cases, his case was a meth habit. Other cases, it's just straight up mental illness, usually with a combination of some self-medication with street drugs and alcohol. And what's interesting is then the question, well, I would imagine, maybe it's a stereotype, and please correct me if I'm wrong. There are alcoholics in Georgia, but you don't have drunks living on the street.
Well, unlike Russia, public drunkenness is really frowned upon.
Oh.
Even though they drink a lot of wine here, and I'm sure there's enough alcoholics to go around. But in fact, and I think this comes from being an Orthodox culture. Not that there isn't a lot of nominalism in their Orthodoxy, but nevertheless, there's that sense. For instance, in the Orthodox Church here, you just pretty much enter any time, and people do. It's not like they go on Sunday. It's like they can dive in on a Wednesday afternoon or something and just kind of hang out, say a few prayers, put a candle in there, listen to. There may not be anything happening, but nevertheless, it's like an anchor point. And even the people who aren't Christians here, like one of my young Georgian friends here said, "Why do you believe in God?" And I said, basically answered her saying like, "Well, because there's a God." Yeah, no point in like beating around the bush, trying to be clever, But I mean, they react here to, there are people who definitely react to the idea of the Orthodox Church and stuff, and it certainly isn't a cure-all for everything. But I think that even those people aren't, they don't have that. They may not like the church. They may show it to each other, but they don't show it in public at all. It's not like something where you don't find that sense of fronting with like, I'm not like you kind of thing. There are a few people like that, very few. But I think generally it's much more of a there are these electronic dance music clubs, and those to me are the locus of where the change is, one of the loci where the change are coming from. Because they will, when you've got loud thumping electronic music playing and it's all dark, and essentially they imported this from Germany back in the late 90s, early aughts. And they tend to look up at Germany, because Germany, if you're going east, is kind of the first place you run into that is the West. So Berlin is like, they always talk about Berlin and stuff. Less about Paris, less about London, less about Amsterdam, and all those kinds of places. Although they do have a kind of this image of America that it's really funny to me. So I will, like, one girl said, "Yeah, I really want to go to America." And I said, "So let me guess." I said, this is your America, the usual places." And she goes, "Well, I really want to go to Ohio." And then I just laughed. I said, "No one wants to go to Ohio. People in Ohio don't want to be in Ohio. What are you talking
Byrne, our Ohio audience, they're crying.
I love you. But they understand. As far as destinations in the country, Ohio is not like something you come to, it's like, although there are some people, who would find
Get the Rock and Roll Museum in Cleveland.
There you go.
It's Cincinnati.
No, I'm not saying Ohio isn't interesting. Walker Percy once said, sometimes the things we consider to be the least interesting are the most interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, who's going to California to visit Sacramento? I'm just saying. It's like, unless you're like a government student or something, it's like Sacramento isn't really high on your list of places. Ohio is the Sacramento of America,
Ohio is the Sacramento of America.
I said it here.
I'll have to name the video that Ohio is I better put it in the comments so I can remember. Ohio is the Sacramento.
Yeah, it's just that normal place that a lot of people live, but you wouldn't tell someone, "Come here."
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, it's a normal place where people live that doesn't have the big attractions that draw people.
Yeah. No, it's sort of, as we say, at least in the States, it's middle America.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, your comment about Germany, that reminded me, I was listening to The Rest is History. They did an episode of Poland and the Renaissance. And part of what struck me, and I think this is, I'm seeing this in this little corner of the internet, Poles and people from Eastern Europe are increasingly sort of making their way, onto the channel. And what's interesting is that now with the fall of the Iron Curtain, a couple of dynamics. Number one, Poland and much of Eastern Europe was very much, part of Europe. The Iron Curtain sort of severed it, And now, 40 years after the Iron Curtain is gone, it's sort of like it takes a while for the connections to be made again. And it seemed like there was just a lot of gravity to the West. And you saw that with Ukraine before the war, and then it seems like with the war, Putin just sort of catalyzed that. And now suddenly, of course, Finland and Sweden are like, okay, we're jumping on the NATO train, and all of Eastern Europe is, it seems, just more and more sort of sucked into the West. And for me, I grew up, of course, during the Cold War, and Eastern Europe was always just sort of this unknown entity on the other side of the Iron Curtain that we knew nothing about. And increasingly, well, realizing that for all the history up until the Cold War was integrated as part of Europe, was that had their own Renaissance, had a whole bunch of this. And so now suddenly, catalyzed by the Ukrainian war, everything's just sort of beginning to mold together. And it'll be interesting to see, because these things never sort of happen. They don't become Germans. The Poles stay Poles, but those influences then just continue to make and create new cultures.
Yeah. Well, also, I think this war has revealed a new fault line, and the fault line is between, as it often is, Germany and Poland. That is to say, because Poland remains more Catholic, remains more traditional and conservative, even though there's plenty of, the kind of students you'd find in America there. Nevertheless, they have, in a sense, chosen not to go full Western. And I see a fault line developing. For instance, Georgia is very much in that place. Ukraine is in that place. A lot of people think Ukraine is going to be, they win the war and they're going to be a place where you have LGBT people on every street corner or something. It's not going to happen. They're pretty much just as conservative as Russia. It's not going to be. So there's this weird. I see this group of countries. Hungary is in there too, in a different way. But also, all those Eastern European countries tend to look at some of the recent developments in political correctness and go like, wait a minute, this is starting to remind us of something that we were trying to hopefully get away from. We wanted to speak freely. We wanted to breathe freely. And now you're telling us you can't say this, you can't do that, you can't question certain things. And so I think there's a fault line out on the eastern perimeter that's, I think, in time going to be stronger. Right now, they're still together. Everybody wants, well, except for Hungary is kind of a little bit of an outlier here, but everyone wants to, make sure Russia stops fighting Ukraine and such like that. And so that's brought a lot of people together, but there's a lot of tension too.
Michael G just said Poland is Catholic mostly on the surface, first place in the world in Pew Research Secularization Poll in 2018. I do wonder, because a lot of there's a fair amount of conversation about the Orthodox Church in Russia, how many people don't go. Obviously a war will certainly stoke nationalism. But, even in the United States, where there's polling and where I live and I see on the street, trying to get a sense of where things are going in terms of religion is almost always tremendously hard. You look for tells such as, do they actually go to church? Right. What percentage, you look at like Church of England, which has, their numbers are absolutely tiny. And so look at Ireland. So one of the places that, I went after the German festival was to Ireland, and we ran some estuary meetings there in Ireland in Marcus Connolly's place. And it was very interesting, the kinds of conversations we were having with people who Okay, are we Catholic? There's just sort of a scrambling going on, and sort of the old style, solidly Catholic, living out the Catholic life, seems to
Right.
be going away, and it's just tremendously hard to get a read on that.
Yeah. Well, also there's the fact that there's been so much migration from the Middle East and Africa into places like the UK and France. I mean, what's interesting is that the final World Cup was France versus Morocco, and
A little bit of history there.
exactly. And but what's happened is every time there was any sort of victory for the Moroccans, they would go out into the streets and start riots and burn cars and do all sorts of stuff. Then the French won the final between them, and there's lots of Moroccans in France, and so the mainstream media is not covering it, but there was huge, like fights and anti-French, anti-Moroccan, insurgencies within, the celebrations. Very strange. But that kind of a thing tends to push people to finding an answer to the problems in their society, and unfortunately, that answer ends up being, well, let's put it to you this way: it isn't multicultural.
Yeah.
It's going to be something, which is why you see more of a rise of conservatism in France than we've seen in probably since de Gaulle, probably since the war, World War II.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what part of what we talked about in our estuary tonight was, I think when you get so much cultural disruption so quickly, and people get disoriented, you sort of naturally see, a conservatism coming back in the country. We certainly saw that in the 80s. I mean, there was so much cultural change in the late 60s and 70s that I think there's sort of a reaction that people say, okay, I just want things to settle down. And of course, in the 80s, we had all of the nostalgia about the 50s. You had Happy Days and American Graffiti, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens again, because things are just moving so quickly.
Right. Although I would say that what happened in the 80s was we certainly didn't return to, say, 50s style conservatism.
No.
There was a synthesis that happened. There wasn't a good synthesis. And what it was there was a new form of conservatism. That is, if you looked at the average people's lives, they didn't look at all like the lives of people prior to the 60s. They looked instead like people who had for instance, this was when churches had, they no longer knew how to hold the line on moral issues, sexual ethics and such, so that after a while, everyone just gave in. Yeah, I guess the young people are just going to live with each other for a while. Yeah, I guess, okay, they've broken up and now they're sleeping with someone new. They just kind of shrugged and said, we don't know what to do. That became part of the new conservatism. I mean, if you look at the alliances now, it's really funny. I often think that what we see now is kind of, I mean, among the people who we could loosely count as anti-woke, that is, say, the different factions and people on the other side of the politically correct sphere, are much like the antagonists from the 1990s getting together and saying, what have our children done? Because there is a lot of both. There is the censoriousness of the 80s and 90s, like Christians and such, inside the very same, like, woke people. They're in many ways they're not in all the ways, obviously, but in some ways very conservative, very censorious. And on the other side, you got that the crazy sexuality and such, and the LGBT stuff is in there as well, which gives you this really strange tension But many of their older siblings and parents who are Gen Xers and such like that are looking at them and saying, wait a minute. And then you look on the same side of your aisle and you'll see people who are gay and lesbians, along with Christians and conservatives, along with fiscal conservatives and left-wing libertarians, as well as right-wing libertarians, all kind of on the other side of the fence. And you just say, wait a minute, what happened? Well, I think the good part of that is we're having the kind of dialogues that should have been had in the 1990s. And I often think, well, what happens if this woke thing finally dies? Do we go back to the other arguments or what? I don't think we will quite in that way. Yeah. But nevertheless, I think that was a good thing that happened. But unfortunately, it's taken this other beast to bring it out. This strange ideology that's got, I often call it a hydra. It's got all these different heads, and if you cut one off, two more show up.
Yeah.
Oh.
Joey mentions an argument that Joan often makes, and I won't make it as good as Joey does. But it's interesting that people sort of freeze their values. They might be progressive values, but they're conservative about their progressive values, and they just keep holding on to them.
Yeah.
And you see those kinds of. It's really sort of a developmental, non-player characterness that I've always been this way, so I'm going to freeze this way. I think the woke wave has already crested. And I think it is receding, and the reactive, I think, as you noted in the 80s, reactive, even conservative reactive movements usually don't recognize how much has actually changed and how much change they have in fact embraced. And you're exactly right. The 1980s conservatives were not like the 1950s conservatives. Conservatism almost always changes way more than they like to admit publicly. And the irony, of course, is that progressives are often far more conservative than they like to admit publicly as well.
Right.
One of the topics in our estuary meeting tonight that was brought up, which is something that I've wanted to talk about in my channel. I've got so many backlisted things that I just simply haven't had time to address. Is we always try to get a handle on the whole, such as Aaron Renn has been doing his positive, neutral, and negative worlds in evangelicalism. Just pollsters go out and say right track, wrong track. I mean, these are evaluations of data sets that we absolutely cannot actually process, and so then we sort of do relevance realization on certain tells, but of course it depends on exactly what are we paying attention to. Right. And so people, and then when you listen to debates, some people say, oh, things were great back in the 50s, and they'll point out, yeah, but they weren't really great if you were African American living in the Jim Crow South. There's a reason they left. Right, and even when we evaluate periods in our own life, am I better off? Ronald Reagan's great line: "Am I better off than I was 4 years ago?" Well, better off in exactly what way? 4 years older, I have less hair. Do I have more money? Is that better off? I mean, these are tremendously difficult things, but yet we and in fact the whole political zeitgeist tends to move on them. And then also, sort of looking back at things. Oh yeah, during the 50s, remember the Cold War when we were, stockpiling nuclear missiles and threatening each other with them?
And I was in one of the last classes where we actually got duck and cover exercises. I remember it in my first grade and second grade, and then they stopped, fortunately. But it tells you something. Okay, we need to go under our seats now, just in case.
just in case.
Yeah. Just in case there's no more classroom.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting though is that for people in our generation, we tended to look back at the 50s as a time of normality, which of course it wasn't. But then the people who are younger than us tend to look back at the 80s, which is why we had this weird fixation with the 80s for far longer than it's healthy. I think, though, that due to what's going on, pandemic, Ukraine, Russia, war, etc., whatever's going to happen with the economy, I think people are going to look back at the aughts, believe it or not. They're going to forget 9/11. They're going to look back at, that's like the last era. There was rock music. It's the last, there was free speech. There was, they'll forget all the unpleasant stuff, but it hadn't yet turned into the political mess prior to social media taking over.
No.
And so people will look back at that the way, not quite the way we look at the 80s, but as a new kind of normality.
Yeah. Remember before the iPhone?
Yeah, exactly.
Remember before the AI chat that everybody's making a big deal of.
Yeah. And these will be people who don't even remember getting their first computer or something like that.
Yeah.
I remember the first time, this weird device. And right now I've just got given a pre-phone. Which one I got? There's this Dutch guy, Peter. I'm still trying to use it, Peter, if you're looking in, because I'm entering this from a much later stage than most people did. So I'm looking at it like, really, do I have to use this? And I do, but I'm sitting there, but I've watched everyone's habits and I'm going like, okay, one of the most evil things is to get notifications all the time. I've watched the way they hear a little ding and they're like, it's like this weird Pavlovian bell that sends people into, it's just like they're no longer present with you because that little bell, whatever it is getting to them. And I'm looking at the behaviors that I've noticed. I'm saying, okay, I'm not doing YouTube on this thing. I'm not editing anything. I'm not trying to use it for, I'll leave that for the computers at home. I'm just trying to use it on the most minimal, use it, but not to the fullest, as Paul would say.
Yeah. That's true. It's true. I was sitting before the estuary started. I was chatting with someone there who's quite a bit younger, and she was talking about computer games, and I just realized that I'm of a generation that people my age don't play. I don't even know what the really hot computer game is. I don't even know the computer game. So she had been watching Jordan Peterson, and after Jordan sort of joined with Daily Wire, she got turned off by that, and then she was watching more YouTube channels about computer games. And again, it's just feel myself on the other side of a big educational divide.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I just put out a couple of videos, and there's going to be a set of 7 by the end called The Creepy and the Cute. And it's
I saw you're doing a new series.
And what's interesting is that the comments I'm getting and the reactions I'm getting are people are saying, "Oh, I knew this was some sort of problem, but no one ever talks about it." And so I'm just kind of uncovering. My next video is the first part of the history of cute. I've already talked about the problem that we have, the curse of the cute. But what it is there are these things that, you see one thing here, one thing there, one thing there. Then after a while, you realize, oh, wait a minute, people are starting to identify as cute. They've gone from, originally it was Mickey Mouse, and then there was a bunch of games and stuff. But then after a while, you start realizing how much, for instance, most of the trans movement is based upon the cute. Because the cute is such a great defense. Because cute is baby-like. And if I'm cute, how can you attack me? Because I'm innocent and baby-like. And like a baby, I will also throw a tantrum when you do. And it's amazing. It's like this underneath thing. I keep looking at that because I'm a firm believer that our aesthetic and cultural conditioning is what plays such a role in who we are, much more than people. I often say to myself, in 1989, I went to a group of university students, mostly grad students. And And this was in New York City. And I had just bought this book called Modern Primitivism, which was the book. There isn't another that kicked off all the piercing and tattooing that has happened since then. And this has a lot of extreme stuff in this book, but a lot of primitive looking tattoos and such. And this was deep subcultural stuff, a lot of S&M subcultural stuff and whatnot. And I brought this book filled with pictures, and all of the students, universally, to a person, none of whom were tattooed or pierced yet, looked at this book and said, "Oh, this is disgusting. This is hideous." And I looked at them and I said, 5 years from now, some of you are going to have these. And then what I've seen since then is that, and I just knew this is going to travel around the world. Why? Because it's identity. Because when you're not just getting a tattoo, you're marking your identity. You're not just getting a piercing, you're marking your identity. And once you mark your identity with something, then it moves from the level of something we can talk about to something we can't talk about. Because now this is who I am, especially in America, where the individual's identity is all. We have only ourselves. And but I have noticed more of that coming here. And with it comes a lot of other attitudes. But I think the technology actually comes first, because what spreads it? Instagram posts. People, when something becomes normal, now you find that the people who are the rebels are the ones who are like, "Nah, I'm not going to get a tattoo." Whereas it used to be the rebels were the ones with the tattoos. But I remember when I saw the first tattoo, I think it was of the fashion model, supermodel Linda Evangelista on the cover of Vogue in about 1991 or 92. And she had a little arm tattoo, which of course now would be like nothing. And I saw that and I said, okay, now this is really going to start spreading, this whole idea. The funny thing was, that was just a temporary tattoo on the cover of that magazine.
She wasn't stupid enough to ruin her career with a stupid tattoo.
Yeah, well, now you get people who do. Because now it's no longer ruining your career. It's now just normal. And I know Christians who get Bible verses tattooed on them, and some do it in Hebrew, and which of course they don't understand the torque that really is, because the Old Testament in the law is pretty dead set against it. And I remember pointing this out to a friend who was going to Biola, and he said, yes, but he gave the argument, we don't follow everything that's in the Old Testament in the law. I said, well, that's convenient. Do you think there was a reason for this?
Oh, it is truly interesting growing older and watching the times change and watching things come around again and noting patterns as they do. And having lived through the 80s and watching fads. I remember when my kids were like, "Oh, I want to get a tattoo," and I told them, I don't trust myself getting a tattoo. Most of the people I know that are my age who got tattoos when they were in their 20s don't really feel too good about their tattoos anymore.
Oh, I know. I knew a Presbyterian minister who had, when he was younger, he was in the military and stuff, and he got a whole shoulder full of tattoos, a whole arm full, and he's now a pastor, and he was just kept that arm covered.
Yeah.
He just felt like, what did I do to myself?
Yeah. I had a friend who had his arms were covered with gang tattoos, and he was working a trade job, and it'd be blazing hot in the middle of Sacramento. He's working HVAC. He was up in attics, but he'd have that long sleeve shirt on, and it's just, it's like, there it is. It's like,
especially gang tattoos, prison tattoos, that sort of thing is really a marker of something. And anyone who can read the signs, like for instance, there's books on Russian tattoos, and each one has a very, very specific meaning. So, a certain symbol will mean you've killed a certain kind of person.
Hmm.
That you're in for rape or something like that. It's very, very specific. Whereas I think what's happened is a lot of our tattoos now are, I think it's people who just want to identify themselves somehow. So, but they also want to do it in such a way as it doesn't seem shocking to anyone.
Yeah,
So
it's
pretty
it,
tattoo.
I think I'm surprised nobody in the comment section has just called out a couple of old dudes complaining about tattoos on the internet.
Here's my thought, but I've had this ever since I started aging out of the cool era of, like it's usually the people in their teens and 20s who are the quote unquote cool kids, is that I realized, it's just like people say, well, it's time for the youth, it's time for them. I go like, I'm still alive. I'm not done. I'm not done until I'm dead. What are you talking about? I'm going to keep fighting on doing what I'm doing until I'm dead. Now, in my particular situation, I've always kept up with cultural things, which kind of gives me every now and then, if I want to play a cool card, I can.
Yeah.
But I don't like to. But someone just this morning, they knew that Byrne's following all sorts of weird stuff. So they sent me a video with visuals and audio that just was like, oh my goodness. And it wasn't, oh my goodness, because it was like obscene. It was, oh my goodness, because it was just too much stuff. Lots of weird, cute stuff. Lots of just weird music, electronic music. And I just said like, okay, I got to think about this. But, but I always have this, when something like that is sent to me, my first reaction is always like, ugh. And then after a while, I start looking at it and pulling it apart and go, oh, okay, this came from here and this came from here. And then I'm all right again.
Yeah, it is fun. It is fun getting the stuff. I'd never have time enough to watch everything that people send me.
Oh, yeah.
But it is really a
well,
thing.
you have far more subscribers than I do, and so you get far more. Paul, I'm here. What do you think? And but yeah, although I did get a very interesting. I did a very interesting interview with an old Labrie worker that I know, a guy named Ellis Potter, who came to Labrie as a Buddhist monk, kind of by accident, back during the heyday of the Schaefer times in the 70s.
Huh.
And he was a very serious Buddhist monk. He lived in a monastery and stuff like this in California. And but his story is really fascinating. And I'm getting some very interesting comments on it. People are saying, do more, do more. His name is Ellis Potter. And he's now a pastor in a church in Basel, Switzerland.
Oh, fascinating.
But yeah, I sense there's a hunger. I specifically wanted to get an interview with him because I sense we're living in a time comparable to the 60s in many ways, when, as Bob Dylan says, the wheels don't speak too soon because the wheel's still in spin and there's no telling who that it's naming. Things are fluid in the sense that we don't know how all of this is going to play out. A lot of people are, whenever I get the black-pilled people telling me that, their conspiracy theory about how all this is happening because of this, I'm going like, you don't understand the way things work. Right now, things are fluid. All sorts of things can happen in a period of fluidity. That's good and bad. And so let's try to do the good,
it's even interesting. So, the IDW thing was to watch in COVID, the falling out between Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein and all these cats, that just kind of whole thing just sort of fell apart. And, I would imagine 10 years ago, someone would have thought they were nuts to have Jordan Peterson on YouTube, just, raising the flag of conservatism. I mean, conservatism is right. One of his big loves right now. And no, we always think we know the way the future is going to go, and we never do. It's always a surprise.
That's why I often tell people I've got my money on chaos. I can't go wrong.
Yeah,
A
who are you
lot of
going to
people
collect
see
from?
some sort of totalitarian, authoritarian future. I'm going like, you really don't understand human nature. You start putting enough pressure on one thing, and then another thing erupts. So it's like, so all this woke leftist stuff comes up, creates all these issues. So all these other people arise to kind of start pointing at it.
Yeah,
So far, so good. But if it gets strong enough on that side, after a while, they're the problem.
yeah. It is.
As
It is
Francis Schaeffer
interesting to
once,
see Dennis Prager and Oz Guinness and Jordan Peterson's Exodus seminar. I mean, two
yeah,
old Cold War voices, and Guinness, such an interesting history. Um,
hmm
you know, grew up in China and that whole period. A lot of, I mean, if people go back far enough, a lot of interesting things. Those China missions were um, a lot of Christian leaders during the
yeah,
Cold War had their start in China before, of course, the Second World War, where they all had to leave, and then with the communists.
right,
Fascinating links.
yeah, yeah. I think we're living in the Chinese curse of interesting times.
Yeah. Were you at Labrie when Oz was there, or I think my friend
No,
Warren
he
Mills
left a
was?
few years before I got there. And in fact, when I first arrived, Francis Schaeffer wasn't there either because he was getting treatment at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Oh,
But then he arrived, and I did get to know him a little bit. And I remember once I was actually traveling with him on a couple of the seminars. I think I went to 3 of them on the Whatever Happened to the Human Race seminars. And I was standing with him behind the stage. We were waiting for something to happen. He was going to be called out or something, but we were talking to each other. And I had been working on, I had already decided at that point, I'm going to start trying to understand cultural history because this seems to be what Christians are so weak on from my observation. So I said, I'm going to start doing that. And music was where I started. And I said to him, so look, now you wrote all this stuff. If I boil down everything you said in all of your books about music, I get about, I don't know, 14 pages. You didn't mean that to be any sort of final statement about anything, did you? And he goes like, no, not at all. And I said, you meant that for us to take that, those of us who were interested in those fields to take that and run further. And he goes, yeah, absolutely. And he was very much, but I'd met people at Labrie, you see, who had kind of gotten stuck I think it's a temptation in any group for people to start using just that framework to look out of. And one of the things I realized, I mean, I remember there was this guy from Minnesota there, and he was always talking about true truth and the upstairs and downstairs, lower story, upper story, and the grace nature dichotomy and all the stuff that Schaeffer would use. And then I said to myself, yeah, I'm not going to be that. I'm not going to be imitating. I just felt like there was something about that didn't work to use that kind of language. So I had to figure out my own ways of explaining things. Plus, for instance, if we look at it now, I think those things are still very important, but we don't. Nobody talks in that language, even at Labrie, that much anymore.
no.
So you have to remain. It's this weird dance between the time and the observation. And as T.S. Eliot said in the Four Quartets poem, you never get the words that you need to say what needs to be said until it's too late.
Wow. That's
Wrestling
true.
with language. You're always trying to wrestle with what the phenomenon. And Rookmacher at one point says, when you're trying to describe something and you can kind of understand it and you have the picture of it, but you can't find the words. He says, that's the truest point of reality. You are now right on it, because once you gotten past it, then something else kicks in, and now you're dealing with history or something. Yeah. But as I've seen in the Christian church, we just get stuck in certain periods, so that the Christians of the 1970s were basically people who had sequestered themselves in a 1950s mindset way too long. And eventually then things change. But then when things change, it's just like there are Christians now who are living in the 1990s.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. Although my growing up was, it was it was part of the civil rights movement. It was a real experiment in Northside. My parents, Northside was a place where in the 60s and 70s, Dutch CRC kids that wanted to go to church, not in the white Dutch church, but with black folks, and black folks who didn't want to go to the black church wanted to go to a church with white folks, and they all sort of embraced that vision of integration. And I was a kid, and so for me it was just normal. I thought, this is
right.
And of course that we were doing heroin addicts rehabilitation in the house that was bought next door, and so we had a lot of ex-junkies trying to stay clean. And again, as a kid, this was all just normal for me. A lot of mental illness. It's so funny because I wound up, I never wanted to, but I wound up basically doing a lot of the same ministry that had been done around me growing up, and it was just kind of like, here it is. But then of course YouTube comes along, and that's then just a total other different thing. So
right. Well, you've done a pretty good job of surfing the waves. Sometimes we all need to realize, okay, that wave's gone, but I don't think it is yet. But because, like I said, everything's fluid right now, so we don't know which way things are going.
No, we do not. Well, I should call this to a close. And
okay, yeah, you're working on a time deficit here.
Well, it's usually about this time for you when we talk, so it's a little bit of a turnaround.
Yeah, I'm fully functional. well, thanks for inviting me in to talk. I appreciate it.
It's lovely to bump into you, Byrne. You enjoy the day.
Yeah, if you ever want to get up on the spiritual, the Eastern spiritual stuff, watch my friend Ellis's conversations. I'm going to invite him back because everyone was really curious. It was only like a 35-minute discussion.
Oh, okay.
And but he has a very unusual way of talking, so that it's kind of like he can make something clear in just a few minutes. And I think this comes from his Buddhist, Zen Buddhist background. He can make something clear in a few sentences that takes other people like volumes to get through.
Wow.
To try to explain. And so anyway,
that's a real gift.
Take care. Have a good night.
All right,
I will have a good day.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.